Greetings, Resident Evil fanatics. It's getting dark out here. Take my hand as we saunter through these sullen streets. I hope you don't mind this certain someone marching beside us. They'll be joining us tonight as we continue our study of the dark and the sinister. Quite a year this has been. Resident Evil novels, William Blake's poetry, and the historical foundations of Onimusha's villains and monsters. Time and time again, we've done our damnedest to dissect each type of evil, peeling them down to their very core. And tonight, more evils await you in this somber city, a city of the dead. Being that this novel was released in 1999, about a year and a half after the advent of Resident Evil 2, it lacks any reimagined scenes from the 2019 remake, most notably the orphanage. But despite this, City of the Dead still offers a wealth of creative embellishments to the original narrative. As established in the previous novel analyses, these books serve as perhaps the most cohesive, believable imaginings of the original RE narratives. S.D. Perry refines the obscured scenes of the games into fully detailed passages, such as Barry's clashes with Wesker behind the scenes of RE1. Each novel rotates perspectives at least once a chapter, which is especially fascinating when told from a villain or side character's perspective. By revealing each character's internal monologue, these exclusive passages contribute immensely to the villains and non-playable figures in particular, as explored through the perspectives of Albert Wesker, James Marcus, and Nicholas Griffith in the previous analyses. The RE2 novel is no exception. While it doesn't provide as many exclusive scenes as the Umbrella Conspiracy, it offers more nuanced depictions of RE2's many secondary characters and villains, namely Ada, Annette, Sherry, and Chief Irons. We've encountered some of these archetypes before in the previous novels, but RE2's long lineup of supporting characters is something else entirely. Thanks to Noboru Sugimura, the key contributor to RE2's writing, the story is much grander in scope and more grounded in its plot progression than RE1. Given that the game story is delivered through 4 scenarios, there's considerably more ground to cover, with the novel being about 100 pages longer than the previous ones. Perry managed to fuse the best of these scenarios into one unique narrative, even though she veers away from the canon scenario routes Claire A and Leon B. Instead, the events of this novel are best described as Leon's A scenario coupled with Claire's B scenario, with some additional snippets at the beginning and end to tie the story into the events of Caliban Cove. Let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get slippery. The gates of hell creak open, and out come its agents of sin once again. 2 new heroes stagger into the limelight, shaken by the impossible frights around them, both pursuing the ordinary, but both caught in the eerie still of the night. The streets are unnervingly calm, malaise in the air all around. This place is overrun by ungodly beings, and after a scuffle, or several, with these creatures, in and out of the police car, the 2 are divided, as if by fate, and begin searching for answers. And that is a succinct overview of the first 75 pages or so, not including the brief intro scene at Brad's house or Ada's exclusive chapter. Aside from those 2 passages, this first quarter of the novel follows the opening cutscenes quite closely, with dreamlike imagery that one should expect from Perry's writing. The raccoon streets really lend to the surreal sense of isolation that defines Resident Evil. Much like RE1's mansion and RE0's training facility, the streets act as a bothersome detachment from the reality we know, mocking our sense of stability. To Leon, they wouldn't be so ghoulish and so sullen on any other night, but tonight was special. The streets weren't what they once were to him. They had changed. It was just his luck, then, that he'd have to trudge through them on his very first night on the job. The tone of his opening passages is very hasty, very akin to Jill's hustle to the STARS office in the RE1 novel, as she fumbles around with her case files, dropping her keys into her hot coffee. Leon is similarly vexed with his tardiness, starving, but left with no choice but to scramble to the station as fast as he could. On his way to the station, the book feeds us little nuggets of backstory, revealing that Leon spent most of his summers in Raccoon with his grandparents before their death. It also states that the RPD building was formerly a library, as opposed to once being a museum, as stated in the RE2 Remake's guide pamphlet and Marvin's memo of both Outbreak File 2 and the Darkside Chronicles. The original RE2 never explicitly states that the RPD was once an art museum, though it was the implication. But I actually appreciate the novel's remix of the RPD's origin, stating that the building was originally a library. Over the course of Resident Evil, the book, The Umbrella Conspiracy, and Caliban Cove, Umbrella cements itself as the bringer of wealth and prosperity, transforming the small town of Raccoon into something much grander. Resident Evil, the book, states that its businesses have undergone drastic enhancements, like its state-of-the-art hospital, a competitive education system, and numerous others. None of these were possible before Umbrella's arrival, so an art museum with lavish sculptures and paintings wouldn't have reasonably existed either. A simple library makes much more sense in the context of Raccoon's evolution, although a library wouldn't have realistically have had so many grand sculptures and pictures in it. Both explanations have their holes, but both are also plausible, granted we offer them a little suspension of disbelief. After this, any additional details on Leon's backstory are pretty sparse. We just know that he cherished this town as a kid and had just barely moved into an apartment in Raccoon, leaving his previous place in New York. There's an added layer of loneliness, of intimidation, in his encounters with evil. Unlike RE1, in which Barry, Jill, Chris, and Wesker first encounter the carriers as a team, Leon hits a Cerberus with his car, and just moments later, he's forced to fend off multiple carriers on his own. He has no Alpha, no Bravo, and neither does Claire. Leon can sense the wrongness in the air when he drives down Bybee, a street usually frequented by college youth and skiers for its cheap theaters and cozy taverns. But tonight, it is deathly still. To Leon, perhaps these streets were familiar no longer. They induced a new type of alienation, conjuring up creatures beyond his comprehension. His first confrontation mirrors the game's opening cutscene quite closely. But funnily enough, the first weapon he produces is a beefy 50 caliber Magnum from his trunk, gifted by his father and uncle after graduating from the police academy. Some of the zombies still take multiple rounds from it before crumbling, so perhaps it wasn't such an excessive choice after all, certainly not as ludicrous as it would have been so early on in the game. Shortly after, he stumbles into our other hero. Claire's opening passage ends her up in Emmy's diner, before speeding away with Leon towards the station, like in the game. But before this sequence, her internal monologue rekindles some backstory elements from the previous novels. If we recall Chris's scenes from Resident Evil, the book, Claire is just barely mentioned in the chapter where Chris checks his voicemail. Now, the same novel did allude to the death of their parents, which was apparently caused by a car crash in that book. But here in City of the Dead, we learn that their father was killed while working his construction job, while their mother was in fact killed in a car crash. Fascinating. Claire's passages then elaborate on Chris's undying concern for her since those brutal incidents. He essentially took on a parental role, guiding her to a solid university, setting her up with a trauma therapist, and religiously calling her twice a month to ensure her well-being, until just recently. He'd become suddenly unresponsive, thus startling Claire out of her comfort and instilling in her a sense of suspicion. She'd started calling up Chris's contacts, dialing up the numbers of David Ford, the RPD officer who wrote the operation report on liquors and weapon storage, Billy Rabbitson, Chris's childhood friend that fuels his suspicion in RE the book and the RE1 novel, and of course, Barry Burton. Along with preserving these details of the Redfields' backstories, Perry also preserves the addition of Jill's father, Dick Valentine, from the first novel. The first chapter takes place in Brad Vickers' home, the same location used to breathe the stars on the Caliban Cove operation. Jill briefly reminisces on her father's wishes for her to leave his trade of thievery and join the police force, and how proud he would be to see Jill now. All of these embellishments yield a more nuanced backstory for each of the STARS members, heroes that have developed organically through the influence of secondary characters and realistic life events. Altogether, these additions constitute the Perryverse, as some call it. A slight distortion of the canon universe established by the games, it is also distinct from the other literature in the franchise, such as Resident Evil, the book. All of these collectively create a type of multiverse for the Resident Evil lore. The Perryverse paints a world with more palpable, multidimensional characters whose histories thrive well beyond the entry in which they are introduced. Each of the stars have distinct experiences that molded them into their current state, amounting to storylines that could very well be real. I wish the games paced the character development in a similar manner, in a way that mindfully gives both the stars and Umbrella's puppets more time to gradually define themselves. Some of Resident Evil's villains are in dire need of this treatment. The most compelling RE villain arcs involve characters that slowly devolve into abomination, driven not solely by money or power, but by the relentless pursuit of something beyond mortal life. The best villains are enticed by evil, tempted by it throughout their lives, before succumbing to it to pursue their utmost desires. Their capacities for evil evolve over time, rather than suddenly emerging and disappearing within a single entry. For example, the reason why Spencer's story arc is so effective is that the character isn't simply the evil European aristocrat he seems to be on a surface level. He is embedded with unshakable convictions. He is mercilessly driven by his worldviews, to the extent that his philosophies have spawned agents of sin on a macro level. His tremendous influence is reflected in Albert Wesker, a man who similarly seeks to ascend through money and power, but he carves his own path from Spencer's, his motives spanning across multiple titles and becoming more complex with each, and then tying back to Spencer in his final entry, RE5. In RE0 and RE1, his motives of money and freedom from Umbrella simply represented his entitled, greedy nature. On a macro scale, they were largely inconsequential, until he was revived with godlike strength and speed.
Sure, I'm not human anymore, but just look at the power I've gained.
His motives, along with his body, would then mutate into something more complex, something more reflective of the influence Spencer had on him. His ambitions were ultimately transformed into a slight distortion of Spencer's in Resident Evil 5. The quest to find the perfect blood, the chosen ones, is an obsession so captivating that it consumes multiple villains and Umbrella initiatives. In a sense, artificial selection is the very lifeblood of Resident Evil. It's what makes these magnificent beings possible, and in a narrative sense, it's a concept that continually drives the villains to do more and to do better. The very prospect of eugenics is beyond heretical in our world and cannot be pursued with the adequate power and influence to keep such practices under wraps. You see, Oswald E. Spencer and his Umbrella Corporation are not merely characters in Resident Evil. They're the embodiments of dissenting worldviews that transcend our own. They seek to venture beyond humankind and will relentlessly hire the ideal talent to do so. Spencer's conviction that the human race is tainted by degeneracy and corruption not only influences his own ambitions, but the impressionable young minds within his reach. Albert Wesker, Alex Wesker, Alexia Ashford, and William Birkin. These pupils aren't just intellectually gifted, they're successors to Spencer's grand vision, their life purposes severely influenced by his unorthodox teachings. Thus, their ambitions are wildly unorthodox themselves. Sinister goals breed sinister practices. What Spencer has created here, Umbrella, is the central source of sin, each of its contributors in a volatile position. Wesker contemplates his own position in the Zero-Hour novel, as he'd seen the bloodshed that befell so many of Umbrella's top players. Thus, he sought to be free from Umbrella after collecting his rewards. Umbrella, then, is its own metaphorical virus that ignites the sin within its own people. It's the catalyst for someone's own individual capacity for wrongdoing, creating unique shades of evil. We've seen those shades in James Marcus, Nicholas Griffith, Albert Wesker, and glimpses of Chief Irons through the literature we've analyzed thus far. And tonight, we'll explore more shades of evil in great detail, here in the RE2 novel. It's already a welcome addition to extend the backstories of Claire and Leon, but villains like William Birkin, Chief Irons, and Albert Wesker are also given ample time to accentuate their motives over multiple novels through their own perspectives, and that's one of the many gifts offered by these books. So far, we've essentially analyzed the scenes within the first 75 pages or so, about a quarter into the novel. By now, we've established the key backstory additions in Leon's and Claire's passages and how they contribute to the Perryverse. Very little is added to our two heroes after the first quarter of the novel. I'm specifically marking this cutoff point as the beginning of the second act, with Leon and Claire each entering the RPD. The two then venture forth, looking for answers, and eventually encounter the real stars of this novel. Chief Irons, Sherry, Ada, and Annette. The 4 bonus perspectives of this novel, each driven by a hidden motive, and each motive with its own criteria for success. But how can our heroes discern a righteous motive from a sinful one? What deems a character evil, and how many levels deep does evil dare to spread? How do the characters' distinct desires and nature awaken their own inner capacities for evil? Resident Evil 2 presents us with the perfect lineup of characters to answer these questions. Together, these 4 embody the theme of ambiguous allegiances when faced by Leon and Claire, a recurring theme of the Resident Evil formula. We know not who these 4 pledge to, nor do we know their true motives or thoughts, until now. The RE2 novel provides a lot of insight on these obscured perspectives. Not only do we experience their journeys behind the scenes, but we gain access to their internal monologue, which makes each of the 4 much more developed than their in-game counterparts. In Resident Evil, the theme of ambiguous allegiances is often coupled with the trope of corrupt allies, usually corrupt superiors. These characters essentially drive their own arc of treachery. Due to the nature of their craft, they bear their phony smiles and say their fake hellos for as long as they can muster. This treacherous ally trope lands most effectively when the character has multiple scenes or even entries to build trust with their feigned allegiance. This is best exemplified by Albert Wesker through the events of RE0 and RE1, and by Chief Irons through Resident Evil the book, RE1, Caliban Cove, and now RE2. There are also several defective ally characters in the CG films, such as Frederick in Degeneration and Wilson in Infinite Darkness, who not only exemplify this trope, but are 2 instances of treachery that are barely distinguishable from one another, ultimately acting as the same figure in similar stories. One carries the vaccines, and the other carries inhibitors.
Why are Will Pharma drugs being brought here?
It's the vaccine.
You? What are you doing here?
He's Will Pharma's head researcher. May I introduce Frederick Downing? He's the one who developed a vaccine for the virus which you, in particular, are so familiar with.
And both are only revealed to be traitors in the final act of their film. Get used to this, because it's everywhere in this franchise. And how appropriate, too, that both of them wear shades. Sunglasses seem to run parallelly across this archetype as well. Beware those shades. The 2 may as well be the same character, but in our study of RE1 and RE2, each of these traitors carry their own nuances that define their distinct capacity for evil, or their own shade of evil. This is where the aforementioned metaphor of the umbrella virus, the catalyst of sin within each of these potential wrongdoers, comes into play. How does Umbrella uniquely affect each of the treacherous characters? Let's begin with Irons and Wesker. Each is a superior officer to the star's protagonists, but each warrants their own level of respect from the heroes. The people of Raccoon respect Irons, but the stars see him for the crook he truly is, despising every fiber of his being outside of his office. But at the same time, the stars fail to realize Wesker's scheme, who gladly feasts on their loyalty, until his mask ultimately crumbles in the final scenes of RE1. Not all treacherous allies are made equal. The charisma of each varies, and their masks chip and peel at varying rates. It is these nuances that define the many shades of evil in Resident Evil. But perhaps the most relevant nuance in RE2 is their varying capacities for compassion. And compassion is a particular nuance that RE2 introduces with its new treacherous ally, Ada Wong. All of these characters succumb to the temptations offered to them. They camouflage themselves among the bearers of justice, assuming positions of power and prestige. They are snakes in tall grasses, slithering for as long as they can, until their true motives begin bleeding out of their facades. But in each of these cases, what incites their corruption? Their betrayal. Usually, the desire for money and power, but especially in these earlier entries of the franchise, money remains the common temptation across each of them. By whom is this temptation offered? Usually, Umbrella. Over the course of these 3 novels, as well as Resident Evil, the book, Umbrella has emerged as the harbinger of sin and corruption. With each entry, this central evil grows ever more insurmountable, its gargantuan limbs yanking on the leashes of Raccoon's authorities. Its omniscient gaze unescapable, and its resources unrivaled. All but a handful of the Stars and Raccoon officials have succumbed to the temptations of money and power. We've seen its influence reach new heights in Caliban Cove, in which the few remaining stars are forced to shrink back on their haunches and hide out in the home of Brad Vickers. And now in RE2 is where Umbrella's influence creates some of the most narratively distinct characters in all of Resident Evil. Here comes the first. While Irons, Wesker, and several other STARS members are bribed by Umbrella's figureheads, Ada takes orders from the enigmatic figure, Trent, who is exclusive to the Perryverse. This is the first time that Trent offers maps and other crucial info to an anti-hero character rather than one of the stars, as seen with Jill in the Umbrella Conspiracy, Rebecca in 0 Hour, and David in Caliban Cove. And while Ada's compassion distinguishes her from the other traitor characters, namely Irons and Wesker, her objective is ultimately the same, doing undercover work in exchange for cash. In this novel, she has a few exclusive RPD passages before meeting Leon, starting about 56 pages in. During them, she constantly reiterates to herself that her reward will justify all the bloodshed, all the excruciating encounters that lead to it. But she lacks the cold, insensitive edge that defines Wesker, as her humanity is much more apparent than his. While Wesker feels entitled to his rewards, cackling that he's quote-unquote going for the gold in RE0 and RE1, Ada succumbs to the cries of compassion within her, shuddering at all the innocent blood spilled in her presence. While Wesker strictly values BOWs for his own self-benefit, doesn't inherently fear them, and even gawks at the magnificence of the tyrant, Ada is struck to her core at the sight of these creatures and the crimson corpses they left behind. Early on in her passages, she searches the RPD hallways for Ben Bertolucci, the reporter. She stumbles across one corpse in particular, Stacy Kelso. Stacy had put her family first, her concern for them outweighing the fear of losing her own life when the outbreak began. She'd been one of the first to meet Ada after Ada had made it to the RPD, and there she was now, soaked in vermilion. This blood wasn't on Ada's hands, but she questions herself incessantly, unable to look away from the corpses, a heavy feeling in her heart. Ada is genuinely irritated at the prick of her own humanity. In this instance and many that follow, she tries to snap out of it and focus on her mission, but a voice inside her eats away at her conscience. Ada wants to be immune to the horrors of lost innocence, to render herself incapable of sympathy, but time and time again, she fails to do so. Her humanity clashes with her objective constantly. This inner torment continues to nag at her, as does her loneliness through her entire mission. Her only solace, her one incentive to trudge through such horrid conditions, is money, just like Wesker. But again, in Ada's case, the bloody entrails around her, the reality of how the liquors came to be, and the cold loneliness of her mission do unsettle her. So much so that visualizing her rewards, as vividly as needed, is all she can do to press on. Some examples of this are when she searches the corpse-ridden hallways and reminds herself, the sooner you finish, the sooner you can collect your wages and retire to some nice island somewhere. Later on, she winces at the possible threat of a nigh-indestructible tyrant coming to retrieve the G-Virus for Umbrella before she could retrieve it for Trent. She then quickly reassures herself that once she collected Trent's sample, she was history, paid and drinking margaritas on a beach somewhere. In a narrative sense, it's more effective for Ada to act as Trent's subordinate, a mercenary fighting for cash under a name that instantly means something to readers of the series. I understand that the enigmatic veil she wears in the games is intrinsic to her character, as she represents the theme of ambiguous allegiance, perhaps more so than any other character. But at the same time, this novel laying her modus operandi out in the open allows the reader to empathize and connect with her much more. It whittles down the barrier that she wears and invites us into her side of the story, which is especially valuable now that we have access to her own point of view. I always felt that her more compassionate, human side was more engaging than her more cryptic one. That inner calling of mercy is massively elevated here in the novel, as we've established through her early passages. In contrast, her motives and depictions in the games are enigmatic by nature, sometimes overly so, and she seems less compassionate and expressive with each progressive appearance in the numbered series. From RE2 to RE4 to RE6, the writers progressively dial up her more cliché attributes of cold, calculated badass, which I never found very amusing or distinctive at all. In RE4, I feel that she could have played a more conflicted, multi-layered persona when encountering Leon, but instead, her scenes with him are much more fleeting and are a shallower version of the silent, ongoing mental gymnastics that define her arc with Leon in RE2. As we'll get to in a moment, these psychic battles are some of the most elevated passages of the entire novel, and they make me wish something similar existed for RE4's Ada. To be fair, Ada's mental games are there in RE4, but they're much more indirect and inconsequential to either of their missions. This is partly because Leon instantly confirms Ada's affiliation with Wesker, detracting from her aura of mystery, but then she and he continue to allude to some even deeper mystery, as if it's still there.
You knew each other?
More or less. Maybe it's about time you told me the reason why you're here.
Maybe some other time.
Their objectives also don't quite collide as directly as they did in RE2. I understand that Ada's dependence on Leon should naturally decrease as she becomes more adept over the course of the games, which then leaves RE2, her youngest self, as the most multidimensional and emotionally intriguing iteration of herself. Whereas in RE4 onwards, she gradually becomes more of a spectacle of herself in the games.
Can't always get what you want, Simmons. Let's call this closure.
And less of a conflicted antihero who clashes with her own morals. The latter is masterfully executed here in this novel. After her exclusive RPD passages, we're left with plenty to work with when she meets Leon. From their very first scene together in the basement, Leon feels a sense of control, a tangible sense of competence from Ada. The back and forth passages between the two are some of the most engaging in the entire novel. They illustrate Ada's ongoing challenge of maintaining her facade, being the treacherous ally. The aforementioned clashes of her humanity and her mission grow ever more deafening, and who could tempt her human side any more than Leon could? This is where her inner cry of compassion rings even louder. This is the struggle between her temptation for self-serving rewards and her unsilenceable wishes to keep Leon alive. When exploring the tunnels and sewers, Ada tries everything to gain the upper hand on him mentally. She plays the "I'm a delicate woman, so I must be innocuous" card a couple times, and she religiously keeps to her cover story of searching for her boyfriend John. When asked about her stellar marksmanship, she even explains that away with her apparent past experience in paintball. It's Perry's little details like these that really amplify this battle of wits between Leon and Ada. But as rehearsed as Ada's cover stories are, as impenetrable as her armor may seem, Leon does pierce through it here and there, and Ada realizes he's not as naive as she might have thought. Little by little, Leon begins to suspect an ulterior motive from her, yet continues to give her his unconditional trust and saves her life time and time again. The careful pacing and progression amounts to a deeply engaging push and pull dynamic between the two. She goes to impressive lengths to fake her incompetence, acting physically weaker than she is, whining over her supposed fear of spiders, and sweet-talking here and there for good measure. She realizes that Leon wants to believe these things, and sometimes he does. But even when he doesn't, his unfaltering desire to protect her shines through for the greater good of her safety. And eventually, her desire to reciprocate materializes in the later passages. Rather than having Leon encounter the G embryo alone like in his A scenario, he pairs up with Ada. During this battle, Ada narrowly avoids being implanted by one of the G tadpoles. It viciously clings onto her dress until Leon rips it off and hurls it onto the wall, and finally, Ada decimates the vermin with Leon's magnum. Ada feels especially shaken and indebted to Leon after this, but tries her absolute damnedest not to show it on her face. When Leon checks on her well-being shortly after, she looks down at her dress, checking it meticulously for rips to hide her feelings. One line here reads, Ada was suddenly very glad that Leon had come along. But of course, her darker side grounds her once again, dismissing those warm feelings inside of her, and reminding her how absolutely ridiculous it was to care what he thought of her. But as she tries to brush away her fears, to cast aside her feelings toward Leon, and regain focus on her objective, she feels terribly lonely. The relentless need to hide her motives had grown beyond bothersome at this point, and all of her phony exchanges with Leon were gradually testing his trust. He becomes increasingly conservative in his interactions with her, especially after their encounter with a G embryo. Ada can sense the harm and suspicion she's instilled in his mind. Later, when Leon takes Annette's bullet for her, Ada's decision to pursue Annette is, fittingly, very pained and reluctant. The guilt of her rushing after Annette is more palpable here, as she knew the bullet would have killed her, but not Leon. I always felt like this scene needed some touch-up in the games on the execution side. After Leon obliterates the maws of the huge crocodile, Ada seriously starts to lose sight of her objective. While she aggressively urged herself not to get emotionally invested in the earlier passages, by this point, she desperately clings to the hope that Leon will survive all this, and feels remorse for the suffering she'd caused him. All in all, her passages illustrate the cry of compassion slowly bleeding out of a conflicted antihero, one who would like to act as stone-faced and heartless as Wesker, but her nature simply won't allow it. She's the treacherous ally that cries to be freed from the chains of greed and treachery. It's a constant push and pull arc that ends with the final confrontation with Leon, in which her inner mercy restrains her from even loading her gun. Her decision not to shoot Leon, as greatly amplified by the earlier exchanges in this novel, is the final prevailment of her inner humanity, one last display of how Leon's pains had pained herself, more so than she would ever care to admit. The metaphorical umbrella virus has awakened the inner conflict between her two halves. Ada is motivated by her greed, but hindered by her compassion, and struggles to find a sane balance between the two. She is the dissonant shade of evil, the victim of disharmony. If for no other reason, read this novel for this intricately detailed and wonderfully paced back and forth between the two. Her passages are truly something special. Well, that was a mouthful, but a necessary one. And now for the next shade of evil. As mentioned earlier, the most effective RE antagonist arcs span over multiple entries. And as for the Birkins, we've explored how Perry set the foundation for William in multiple of the previous novels, namely 0 Hour, but also with more vague mentions in The Umbrella Conspiracy and Caliban Cove. In 0 Hour, we see a younger, more spineless depiction of William Birkin. We can sense his undying wishes to manifest something beyond humankind, but those wishes have yet to be realized. His dynamic with Albert Wesker defines the two as yin and yang. While Birkin is genuinely captivated by the advancement of the progenitor virus and its applications, Wesker solely seeks to exploit these advancements to gain money and power. While Wesker was greedy, entitled, and heartless, Birkin was a neurotic, spineless type of persona, wincing at the vaguest signs of danger. Despite his ghastly line of work, Birkin was a mere weasel to the lineup of corrupt men he worked with. This makes his descent into paranoia and his malformation all the more crushing in Resident Evil 2. We also caught little glimpses of his name in Jill's PDA device in the RE1 novel, as well as in Caliban Cove, being one of the seminal figures that rivaled and inspired Nicholas Griffith, the archetypal mad virologist of that book. And now finally, in RE2, is when Birkin's obsessions would consume him and command him, just as they did with Marcus.
Alpha Team, have you retrieved the sample yet?
Affirmative. We'll be at the rendezvous point in 1 minute.
Roger.
But unlike Marcus, Birkin's consciousness was not preserved after his malformation with G, leaving him to stew in an aimless frenzy of rage, which effectively explains why William himself doesn't have his own passages in the novel. While he wouldn't be coherent after his malformation, Perry could have opted to include some early passages that described William's injection in real time, like the exclusive passages of Ada in the RPD before meeting Leon. But instead, she decided to retell William's journey through the perspective of a traumatized Annette, much like the game does with its famous cutscene. Much like Birkin and Wesker in the RE0 novel, and Wesker in the RE1 novel, Annette observes a long, arduous vigil in the monitor room of the Nest lab, grieving over her husband's sanity and monitoring the deaths of the researchers. She reminisces over the achievements that William would have landed had Umbrella not ruined everything. It's again reminiscent of Marcus's passages in 0 Hour, in which he rants and raves over Umbrella's treachery. He vows vengeance with a much more campy, pretentious tone that alludes to Christ's resurrection, wanting to bring hellfire to Earth. A similar breed of hatred burns through Annette here. Her passages really capture the solitude, anguish, and rage that drive her motives. Her tone is very convincing, albeit much less dramatic than that of Marcus. Here, she wants to auction away the G-Virus to any high-bidding corporation that isn't Umbrella, ensuring that Umbrella would get nothing more from the Birkin family. Annette's paranoia of Umbrella possesses her, just as it did William. The longer her passages go on, the more you feel the parallels between Marcus and William. As explored through our zero-hour novel analysis, Wesker and William Birkin are essentially spitting images of Spencer and Marcus, respectively. Marcus is ultimately the father figure and mentor of Birkin, both being of the mad virologist archetype. The main difference, narratively, is that Birkin's hatred, his desire for vengeance, is incommunicable, save for the scarlet messes he leaves in his wake. We see his sorrows, his anguish, and his fury rippling through his wife, and to an extent, his daughter, as we'll explore later on. When confronting Ada in this novel, Annette immediately takes her to be an Umbrella agent, which builds nicely off of her previously established paranoia. Annette recounts William's transformation with similar lines to that of the game, but there's a layer of added nuance to their struggle before Annette tumbles down into the depths below. One line reads, "Annette was physically weaker, but she was driven by demons of hatred and loss, the edge of insanity lending her strength, but no sense." After grappling for Ada's gun for a moment, Ada suddenly lets go entirely, Annette's backward momentum driving her against the railing of the bridge before being struck by Ada's elbow, sending her over the railing. It's a small addition, but it offers a more believable climax to their struggle, certainly much more so than the inane slap that ends it in the game. After waking, excruciating aches all over, Annette lowers the bridge and starts up the ventilation fan to slow Ada's progress and encounters Claire. Funnily enough, she wrongly accuses Claire of being an Umbrella agent, just as she had with Ada, which again results from her ceaseless paranoia. Through her frantic, grief-stricken eyes, any evil is an evil brought by Umbrella. It's this vile hatred in her passages, marked by crippling grief, anguish, and wrath that allow William's vengeful spirit to bear its fangs through his wife. And sadly, as she clutches her broken ribs and saunters back to the facility, she blames herself for letting Ada gain the upper hand, apologizing to William for her incompetence. Everything ties back to William. When sleeping on the tram back to the facility, she even hopes to dream of her husband. When she spots him in his horrid state, she grins at the prospect of obliterating him in the self-destruct sequence, of leaving nothing behind for Umbrella to extract the G-Virus from. It's a sick and twisted love, a grim delight, but it's all that Annette is left with at this point. This is what Umbrella has done to the Birkins. In Annette's case, the metaphorical Umbrella virus has awakened a vengeful shade of evil in her. She's been rendered a zombie that groans and drawls, longing for retribution against Umbrella. We are offered avenues to empathize with her that aren't so pronounced in the games. Unlike the other shades of evil, her despair isn't a result of giving into temptation. It's simply the product of engaging in her husband's ungodly passions. And that despair is only amplified by the notion of her young daughter, who is yet to be found. This novel's take on Annette's and Sherry's relationship lends to the more sorrowful, remorseful tone of Annette's character. She and William had made promises to invest more time in Sherry, but William's ambitions were too exciting, too rewarding, and too draining for her to give Sherry adequate attention. And now, with her plan to destroy the Nest Lab and escape with the G-Virus, Annette seeks to redeem her motherhood, to give Sherry the love that she was so long deprived of, but only when the time was right. In this novel, Sherry would be sent to live with William's sister when found without her mom, as it was written in both of their wills. Annette plans to let things cool down for a few months after destroying the facility, then collect Sherry. But of course, all of this would be for naught should Sherry not survive this calamity. Annette's more nurturing side is almost akin to her portrayal in Resident Evil, Welcome to Raccoon City, in which she cowers in fright at William's macabre obsessions. But here, she engaged in those obsessions with him, now left to stew in a puddle of remorse and anger, with William malformed and Sherry nowhere to be found. Sherry has numerous exclusive passages in this novel. Approximately 100 pages in, we are invited into the imaginative mind of a 12-year-old girl. It's pretty impressive how rich these passages are, considering how abrupt all of her appearances and disappearances are in the original RE2. She would often run off and reappear with little rhyme or reason, but here, Every step of her scenario route is etched in great detail. Whether it involves hiding in the ventilation shafts early on, spying on Chief Irons, sleeping in a blanket while hiding, running off after a first encounter with Claire, getting sucked into the lower chambers of the gunky sewers, or navigating back up to the surface, each of her little undertakings are nicely detailed. Because of this, Sherry's passages feel very distinct and self-paced, rather than depending on Claire's scenario to string everything together. Sherry relies on her own emotional fortitude to press onward, and although she is noticeably more fragile early on, she is quite self-sufficient, a skill learned from enduring her parents' absence for so many years. While hiding before and after Claire's initial meeting with her, she finds comfort in some very particular set pieces around Iron's office. Her designated hiding spot is between two knights in this room, often snoozing there in a blanket Miss Addison had given her. And whenever she hears William's animalistic growls, she finds solace in the bleak possibility that the tiger in the hallway will frighten him away. She even acknowledges that she's too old to believe that, but in her desperation, every little ounce of hope helps to boost her morale. It's always a treat to see props play a more substantial role in the narrative of Resident Evil. Many of the RE books have attempted to tie the discovery of maps, items, and environmental props into the ongoing narrative, which is especially apparent in our analysis of George Trevor's secret files on the residents of evil. These background elements in Resident Evil, that are often arbitrarily chosen and serve little purpose, become much more animated and memorable when tied into the supplemental literature like this. The tiger is effectively a symbol of courage for Sherry, the silver lining in the dreary night that had befallen her. In this novel, her first encounter with the outbreak was during school. Annette had then told her to head to the police station, as it'd be safer. Despite the ghastly beings that threatened her on her way to the RPD, she reminisces in the plainest of words on how a zombie had eaten her school teacher, Miss Addison, just like that. I adore how simplistic and childlike the tone of her passages is, especially in comparison to the other perspectives. It almost mimics how Sherry herself would be writing her own story. It captures the trembling voice of innocent youth when faced by incorrigible evil. For instance, she describes the Lickers as inside-out men and simply describes William as the monster many times over, as she is unaware that the monster is her father. But despite her simplicity in tone, Sherry's passages add an impressive layer of realism to her decision-making and overall judgment. Perry seems to have struck the perfect balance of vulnerability and maturity in Sherry's character. She struggles to endure the loneliness she'd felt for so long, a solitude born of her parents' negligence, even before the outbreak. Early on in her passages, her weaknesses are much more apparent before meeting Claire. She's fragile, and often at the verge of tears, which is totally fitting to a lonely preteen on such a horrid night. Claire is the panacea to her woes. Well, not quite. But she is the vital building block of Sherry's mental toughness. Like her parents, Claire feels the need to sugarcoat her words to protect Sherry's innocence, which Sherry both appreciates and despises. On one hand, Claire's soothing tone is much needed after surviving solitude and hiding from macabre entities for what seemed like forever, but being the daughter of two parents that put their obsessions over their own child, she's sick of being talked down to and left in the dark. And Claire, as if answering Sherry's wishes, starts to talk on a more even level with her, when appropriate of course. When Sherry describes the monster, also known as William, Claire responds by saying, "I feel like it's my job for now to watch out for you. And if the monster comes, I'll kick its ass, okay?" Sherry finds herself laughing and appreciating Claire's more unfiltered, unadulterated tone. Later on, Sherry even catches Claire slipping back into her more motherly, sweet-talking tone, calling her out on it. When Claire tries to reassure Sherry that her parents are fine, she says, "They're probably still waiting at the plant, hiding and safe, waiting for people to come from outside of the city to make everything better." Sherry interrupts her to say, "You mean kill everything? I'm 12, you know. I'm not a baby." It's a recurring frustration that irks Sherry in many of her passages, which she describes in her inner monologue as stupid grown-up lies, namely when Claire leaves her to enter Iron's secret lair by herself. It's a completely different type of back and forth than Leon's and Ada's, one that slowly illustrates Sherry's loss of innocence, her growing disdain for her image as a weak, naive child. All the shelter and all the sweet-talking just wouldn't appease her anymore, and she wanted to make it known. Just as a quick aside, this harkens back to my early interpretations of Blake's poetry, often exploring the loss of innocence in young minds. Sherry, much like Virgil of Devil May Cry 5, has been exposed to the horrors of the fallen world at a terribly young age. She's been stripped of the protections offered by the unfallen world and is fully aware of the corruptive influences that threaten her from all angles. The time of innocence is fled, for experience has corrupted the innocence of Sherry Birkin. Leon has several lines at the end of the novel that allude to this loss of Cherry's childlike vitality. When he is introduced to her by Claire, his passage reads, "Sherry returned his smile, a wary, too adult smile that seemed out of place. She was too young to smile like that. One more rotten deed to lay at Umbrella's door, innocence stolen from a child." It's disturbing to think that the canon scenario routes, Claire A and Leon B, would have subjected her to an even darker fate, being riddled with her father's plague, the G-Virus. But even with the novel's Leon A and Claire B scenarios, we've seen the damage dealt to her psyche and the dire need for Claire to salvage those pains. The metaphorical Umbrella virus has inflicted multiple wounds on her. By consuming the very lives of William and Annette, Umbrella sapped away the time, the love, and the attention that would have been bestowed upon Sherry. She is no shade of evil. She is a tragic byproduct of Umbrella's sins and the sins of her father. And now, onto the darkest shade of them all. This man just radiates corruption. His character in the novels, up until RE2, is merely a background obstruction, a silencer of truth. Here's a quick recap of his roles in the previous novels. He impedes the Star's progress in the RE1 novel and Resident Evil, the book. In these books, Irons and Wesker reject Chris's proposal to inspect the Spencer estate directly, to hide Umbrella's secrets. Then, in Caliban Cove, Irons invalidates the Star's testimonies after the mansion incident. After the Stars had been suspected of operating while intoxicated by the city council, Brian Irons had complied with their decision to discharge the Stars from the cannibal murders case. He was fully intent on maintaining his PR with Umbrella and the people of Raccoon. His precious town, his money, and his ambitions couldn't be tainted by any hint of Umbrella's corruption, so he kept his mouth shut and let the Stars suffer. Along with Wesker, he is the classic corrupt superior of Resident Evil. Anything beyond his scheming politician guise was left to our interpretation. Until Resident Evil 2. This novel describes his early relationship with Umbrella as a golden age for him, during which he'd act blind to the company's wrongdoings in exchange for political esteem and money, in the events we just recapped, as well as several years prior to those. Life was good during this time. In his eyes, it wasn't until the Birkin's meddling that he'd have Umbrella's eyes all over him, through bugs and spies. Here, Irons and William had a mutual respect for each other. He recognized William's humble desires to maximize his own potential, but Irons bitterly regrets his candid approach later on, when William's spies sap him of his privacy. Annette had approached Irons just a few days after the Spencer estate was engulfed in flames, offering $100,000 to silence him on William's research of the G-Virus. In the game, the bribe money is actually $10,000 rather than the $100,000 in the novel, which does seem pretty minimal to purchase multiple lavish art pieces for himself. It's another tiny detail that adds realism to the larger narrative. The game file, Secretary Diary A, alludes to this bribe, and presumably his other bribes, as it reads, "I heard that all the art pieces from the Chief's collection are rare items, literally worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." I don't know which is the bigger mystery, where he finds those tacky things, or where he's getting the money to pay for them. This is funny, since the art is literally written to be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars here, but the bribe money in the game of $10,000 doesn't even come close to covering these macabre paintings. Even combined with his rewards from keeping the mansion incident and previous Umbrella initiatives a secret, it doesn't quite add up, especially considering the G-Virus probably warranted the largest bribe of them all. But we don't know that for sure, and this is again a lore detail that requires a little suspension of disbelief. Later in that same file, it reads, "I wasn't surprised to see the Chief come in today with yet another large picture frame in his hands. This time, it was a really disturbing painting, depicting a nude person being hanged. I was appalled by the expression of the Chief's face as he leered at that painting. Fascinating." This is the essence, the dark heart of Irons' inner desires. The painting is akin to his passion for taxidermy, a craft that he honed in his own secret lair of the RPD, which he refers to as the Sanctuary in the novel. It's this obsession, or hobby as he calls it, that fuels his unique capacity for evil beyond the sleazy mask he wears as a police chief. At this point, Umbrella had cracked down on William, hungry for his shining achievement, and Irons knew he would be next. Umbrella had severed their ties to him, and thanks to them, his beloved city was reeking with death and decay. He promised himself that he'd take Umbrella down with him, that no one would escape his beloved town after what they'd done to it. After their betrayal, these obscene trophies of his, of macabre, nude women, either on a painting or taxidermied up on his wall, were all he had left. And his pursuit for another is etched in psychotic detail here in this novel, as we'll analyze in just a moment. But first, I want to touch on Irons' strengths and weaknesses. The stars of the previous novels, despite not knowing of his risque hobbies, could still sense the sordid, disingenuous air that emanated from him. As mentioned earlier, not all facades are created equal. The mask of this treacherous ally isn't as cunning as Wesker's or as rehearsed as Ada's. Charisma and guile aren't what he uses to hide his motives. Instead, he relies on his years of networking and public esteem to retain trust in the people of Raccoon City. One example of this in the novel is the strong rapport Irons had built with Mayor Warren. His years of networking would shield him from being found out further, at least for a while. In the Mail to Chris game file, Raccoon's internal investigations lets us know that Mr. Irons had been arrested under suspicion of rape on 2 separate accounts during his years as a university student. He underwent psychiatric evaluation as a result of the charges, but was released due to circumstantial evidence as well as his phenomenal academic standing. Little did the stars know that his seeds of sin were planted so early on. Such seeds of sin are poetically alluded to at the very beginning of the novel, in a quote from Jawaharlal Nehru, one of India's former prime ministers. The quote reads, "Evil unchecked grows. Evil tolerated poisons the whole system." Irons was perversely molded by these early experiences, while Ada, Annette, and Wesker represent unchecked evil, relying on their masks to conceal their greedy motives. Iron represents evil tolerated. He internalized that he could commit unspeakable crimes and get away with it, given a level of esteem and power. And now, he continues to manipulate the system to fulfill his foul urges. And those urges materialize when he finds the daughter of Mayor Warren during the outbreak. After Warren is viciously devoured in the RPD basement, Irons narrowly evades the creatures and carries the mayor's daughter, Beverly, to the sanctuary, of course, the private room reserved for his macabre hobbies. How appropriate. The tone of his passages is masterfully complemented by all of the aforementioned lore. As he carries Beverly, every one of his frantic thoughts, his creepy musings, warrants some kind of self-righteous justification. His internal monologue is a back and forth of false righteousness and perverse fantasies, a blurry mess that sails somewhere between reality and his lewd imagination. After taking Beverly down into the sanctuary and laying her onto his table, he supposedly hears her saying that she didn't feel well and that she wanted to go home. Then when he takes her back upstairs, he contemplates his quote-unquote confused moments just a few minutes ago when he had molested her corpse and felt her intestines in the sanctuary. It's all just a chaotic array of justifications that fuel his sick fantasies, and this type of writing works very well with his character. He incessantly doubts his own memories and sprinkles in little euphemisms to divert his attention from his true wants. Later on, he wonders if he had killed Beverly himself, which of course, he had, and then slowly presses his handgun to his own midsection, tempted to take his own life. But he falsely perceives more words slipping out of Beverly's mouth, of course stopping him in a way that again appealed to his fantasies, saying, "Think of what you can do now that everyone is gone and there's nothing to stop you." Which sums up his shade of evil perfectly. His numerous crimes had been tolerated by Umbrella for years, and now that they had destroyed his city, his darkest pleasures were all that he had left. When Claire approaches him, he takes her to be an Umbrella agent due to his blind hatred of them, much like Annette does in her passages. He even believes Umbrella is using his vulnerabilities against him. Why else would they send someone as attractive as Claire? Thankfully, his madness is thwarted in a cathartic flash of carmine, as Birkin's claws eviscerate him and send his torso flying back up into his precious sanctuary. And that, much like Wesker being impaled by the tyrant in RE1, or disemboweled by the chimeras in the RE1 novel, is an ironic reversal of trying to hide Umbrella's secrets and instead being slaughtered by them. That's him, Brian Irons, the tolerated, perverse shade of evil of Resident Evil 2. This was a long night, perhaps the longest and darkest yet. Tonight, we analyzed one of the most narratively rich novels in S.D. Perry's series of 7. We've seen the many different nuances, or shades, of the treacherous ally archetype, and how being infected with the metaphorical umbrella virus has ignited their distinct capacity for evil. It's no surprise that this novel warranted so much for me. Its wealth of secondary characters and continued backstory elements is quite impressive, and it cements the Perryverse as a respectable distortion of the RE universe established by the games. City of the Dead really makes every character distinct in their perspectives. They steer their own course, with their own voice and nuances. Some of the bioweapon encounters are patched up and build their relationships more fully, like Leon and Ada taking on the G-embryo, as mentioned earlier. The imagery of Mr. X, Birkin, and the Lickers builds on our initial perceptions of them, staying loyal, but also offering more to our imagination, with very grotesque, vivid descriptions. It's a longer ride compared to the others, at 300 plus pages, but it's well worth it. Thank you for watching. To make it this far, one must be daring and one must be hungry. My editor and I worked many hours, day and night, to produce this. I hope you enjoyed the phenomenal work he's done here. Special thanks as well to my supporters on Patreon. Mark 5, Andre Novoa, The One and Only W, Tina, Captain Redfield, Jareel Moon, Michael Let's Play, John Wick, Albert Kessa, Joseph Whitehouse, Kokujin, and Thomas Brunner. Thank you for going above and beyond to support my content. Be sure to follow me on Twitter for lore tweets and check the YouTube community tab for updates on my latest projects. If you'd like a more centralized place for discussion on Resident Evil lore or otherwise, feel free to join the community Discord. I wish you, and our special guest, a good night full of rain and frights. I'll see you again, I'm sure. Perhaps, just as the tiger saves me.